It's 9 Chevy with a 396, beauty heads and a hearse on the corner. Hi, how you doing? Welcome back. The parking lot. I'm the Professor, Chris McCusker, and welcome to another edition of the Quarantine Management Institute. In today's episode, we're going to look at stages of a crisis. There are 4 stages of a crisis that we'll talk about, and it's important for us to recognize that when we are trying to manage a crisis situation, the kinds of management challenges that we must address are different depending on the stage that we're in. It's also important, I think, for us to recognize that there's a holistic problem here. It's not just about surviving the crisis. There are other stages to think about as well. So let's get started. Let me show you the 4 stages of a crisis, each of which needs to be managed and each of which presents unique management challenges. The first stage of a crisis is the pre-crisis stage. During the pre-crisis stage, we want to prepare for the crisis. We want to anticipate what the crisis might look like, different types of crises we can think of, and try to prepare as best that we can at different levels. At the level of families and homes, at the level of businesses and workplaces, schools, at the level of communities, nations. We want to think about what are the possible crises that might happen and how prepared are we. In the pre-crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the pre-crisis stage, we don't get very good marks. I would give myself an F. I was not prepared in any way for this pandemic. It came out of nowhere. It's not something I had anticipated. Not something really that I thought about much. And that may be true for you and your family or a community, your workplace, your school, your business, and certainly in the nation. Now, we did have some warnings. President George W. Bush here in the United States had read a book about the 1918 flu pandemic, and as a result of that, began preparing for a pandemic such as this. Those actions kind of fell off, and we certainly are grateful for what was done. I think I've heard many people comment that if we didn't take the actions that were initiated by President Bush, we would be in worse shape than we are now here in the United States. Now, I don't know about what's happening in other countries, what kinds of preparations were made. But I know personally, and I would say for the nation, the United States of America, we weren't really well prepared for this. This is important to recognize because the preparation that happens in the pre-crisis stage will affect the success we have in the other stages for overcoming the crisis. So because we weren't really prepared ahead of time, the survival of the crisis is more difficult, the recovery is more difficult, and so on. We have to recognize that part of what we're dealing with is the lack of preparation. I wouldn't blame anybody. I would start with myself and say I wasn't really prepared. I wasn't really seeing this coming. Bill Gates also, I should mention, had given some warnings about the possibility of an airborne flu-like pandemic and tried to alert people to our lack of preparation for such an event. Okay, but that's in the past. Well, here we are. We're now in the survival stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here the idea is to survive the crisis. We got to get through it. We got to survive. We want to protect people. We want to try to not to lose. It's sad when we're losing lives in this stage. We're surviving and we're not surviving, but we've got to work hard to try to survive this crisis. There are many challenges that come up during the survival stage. I will, in subsequent episodes at the Quarantine Management Institute, try to identify some of those challenges that I can address on the basis of my experience and my academic background. But there are other challenges also that are important that I can address. But we will talk about some about dealing with strong emotions, a little bit about dealing with stress, the challenges of dealing with leadership and team issues in the context of surviving this crisis. The third stage of a crisis is recovery. This is when we get back on our feet. The crisis has passed. Nobody is dying anymore. Nobody's getting sick anymore. We're trying to bring ourselves back from this this very difficult time, and we have survived this pandemic. I believe we will survive and we will recover. There are different challenges with recovery. We'll talk about some of those as well. And then lastly, the fourth challenge is not typically included, but I included here. The fourth stage of a crisis is renewal. Usually, if you look at textbooks about crisis management, they talk about pre-crisis survival and recovery. I've added renewal based on specific experiences that I've had. Namely, being at Tulane University during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. President of Tulane, Scott Cowan, did an outstanding job with the survival and recovery stages of the crisis, but then introduced a fourth stage. To all of us at the university, he introduced this idea of renewal. The idea of renewal is to find a way to express our values in the post-crisis environment. In other words, we've recovered, we're back on our feet, but now moving forward in this new environment, the post-crisis environment is always new. How do we express our values? What do we learn as a result of the survival and recovery stages? And part of the renewal is to address those problems that were identified, but then also thinking of a renewal in terms of who we are, what do we stand for, what are our values, and how do we express those values in the post-crisis environment. So we have four stages in a crisis: pre-crisis, survival, recovery, and renewal. We have to recognize that a lot of the challenges we have to do with not really being prepared. And I wouldn't say it's anybody's fault. I don't think it makes sense to blame. I start by looking in the mirror and saying I wasn't prepared either. Hopefully in the future we will be more prepared as a result of this. Survival is what we're dealing with right now. We're close to the apex maybe. We'll have to see how it goes. We don't want a double apex. We've got to survive. Some of those challenges we will address. We'll also talk about recovery and renewal. Okay.